Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Barbara Alvarado, and I'm the chair of this San Jose State Society of American Archivists Student Chapter. We're really excited to have you here and to share this wonderful presentation with Loni Shibuyama from the One Archives at USC Libraries. Before we get started, we're going to go over some basic housekeeping. So please just remember to stay muted. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to include your questions in the chat, and we're going to be keeping track of that throughout the presentation, and we will share that with Loni during that point. We'll try our very best to get through all of your questions, so we appreciate your patience. Yes, and we will also be including links to our club website and also to the One Archives social media accounts and also their website. So if you want to learn a little bit more about One Archives, you can do that after the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to let our Vice Chair, Jenny Gallipo, introduce our guest speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Gallipo. I'm the Vice Chair for SAASC. And I'm really excited to introduce our guest speaker tonight. So I'm going to go to the introduction slide. So the guest speaker for tonight is Loni Shibuyama from the One Archives at USC Libraries, where she is the archivist and librarian. So from here, I'll pass the mic to Loni to start our presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And so to get started, thank you everybody so much for having me speak tonight. Thank you to the SA Student Chapter for inviting me to talk. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about more about our archives and to let you know what we do. So next slide, please. So yeah, my name is Loni Shibuyama, and my official title is the One Archives Librarian, but my role is really more as the archivist for the One Archives at the USC Libraries. One is the largest collection in the world that's dedicated to specifically collecting LGBTQ history. And tonight I'll give you an overview of our organization and talk about some of our origin story and our development as a community archive. And I'll talk about a little bit about what we do today and our transition into the university library setting at USC. And I'll highlight some of our collections and give a sample of the variety of formats that we have available for research. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about our staff and particularly my role as an archivist. So next slide. So I'll get started at the very beginning. This is the origin of our story. One was originally founded as One Incorporated in October 1952 in Los Angeles. It was a group of mostly gay men and a few lesbian women who were holding secret meetings and discussion groups at people's homes in Los Angeles, talking about homosexuality and the identity and arguing about philosophical issues around homosexuality and what next steps will be in our place in society. So a smaller subgroup of one of these meetings got together and decided that they wanted to try to reach more people around the country. And they thought the best way to do this would be to publish this magazine simply called One. It was first published in January 1953 and became the first nationally distributed gay magazine in the United States. It was sent out in plain brown envelopes And but even at that time, postal authorities would often open the mail and confiscate issues so that readers would never receive them. In 1954, in particular, there was an issue from the October 1954 issue that the Postal Service refused to send, saying that the material was obscene. The content in particular that they were calling obscene was this basically very innocent short story about two lesbian women called Sappho Remembered, who had an intimate moment, but intimate moment, very innocent by today's standards. It was something like this woman was brushing the other woman's hair. So obviously nothing very explicit about it. But the postal inspector called it pornography at the time. And the One Incorporated sued on behalf of their First Amendment rights. And a legal battle started from that point on that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1958, One Incorporated won that case. And so that was really one of the first issues brought to the Supreme Court based on a gay and lesbian civil rights issue. So in the 1950s and 60s, One Incorporated was one of only 3 homophile organizations that had a national reach in the United States. The 2 others were called Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis. And when I refer to homophile, I'm talking about the period before Stonewall, between World War II and before Stonewall, when these groups started forming to celebrate homosexuality, to talk about homosexuality, to form information and resources around education, but not necessarily what we might think of as the later gay civil rights movement that happened in the post-Stonewall 1970s era in particular. Next slide, please. And so from the 1950s onward, One had a lot of different functions, which included publishing scholarly journals and books around homosexuality, convening gay studies classes, holding monthly public lecture series with activists and professionals. For example, lawyers who can talk about LGBT-related legislation or civil rights laws. And One also organized things like gay-themed European tours, conferences, and art exhibitions. So the photographs that you see here on the right, the top one is the book release of one of its publications called The Keeble. And this is one of the only color photographs that we have of that era, of that time. The photograph on the bottom is a black and white photo of one of its lectures. And so the woman lecturing in that photograph is Evelyn Hooker, who was really one of the first allies and psychologists, psychiatrists who talked about homosexuality not as a mental illness. So that's her giving her one of her lectures. So throughout its existence, there has always been a research and educational component to its mission. By the 1990s, the operations having to do with publishing and gay studies classes ended, and the focus shifted mainly to being an archive and library. And throughout that time, it was also an independent nonprofit organization that was mostly run by volunteers. Next slide, please. So 1994 is when it officially became a research library and archive. And in 2010, we joined with the USC Libraries, and we are now one of their 20 plus research libraries on the 2 main campuses at USC. So this is a picture of our reading room. Of course, our collections are housed in a building just north of the USC campus. And it's what used to be a frat house, actually. It's the fraternity house for Delta Phi Delta, Delta Tau Delta, who one of the fraternity brothers was Will Ferrell, actually. So we have pictures of him in our reading room, what is now our reading room, running through it naked. So we don't have pictures, but I've seen it online and stuff like that. So see, we're open 5 days a week, and we welcome researchers of all kinds, whether they're scholars, filmmakers, artists, community historians, students. We also teach classes to teach the classes about archival research and primary source research, and provide reference assistance to people all over the world, basically. In addition, we also have a small exhibition space in our building where we have rotating exhibitions organized by our curator. So currently we have 2 exhibitions, on one called Foucault on Acid, which is based on letters that we have in our collections, where Michel Foucault befriended this guy named Simeon Wade, and in the 1970s they went to Death Valley and had an acid trip, and there has been discussion. There's discussion about how much these drug-related experiences affected or played into Michel Foucault's theories. We also have an exhibition called 6 Linear Feet, which is an invitation to 6 artists to sort of responding to our collections, but also responding to their experience with COVID and the pandemic. In addition, we also loan materials to outside exhibitions. We recently had some items at the Natural History Museum for their collection exhibition on the women's suffrage movement. And a previous exhibit that we put together, Access Mundo, has been traveling around the country over the last 3 years. So next slide. So for more information, this is our website. There's access to our databases and information on how to request materials and make appointments. From here, you could also get access to our digital library, where we have several thousand items digitized and available to view online. We have around 10 to 12,000 linear feet of archival material. We also have nearly 40,000 books, 13,000 periodical titles, as well as audiovisual items, ephemera, and artworks. And the bulk of our collections date from the early 1950s through the 2000s, but some of our materials go back into the mid-1800s. And we're continuing to collect all the time. So that is definitely part of our ongoing collection development. And the strengths of our collection are primarily United States, and particularly California in the 20th century. And we are perhaps one of the best collections in the country to document that early homophile period. So that period before Stonewall, where there was the earliest forms of organizing around gay and lesbian issues. But just to give you some samples and highlights of some of the materials we have. Next slide, please. So yeah, I'm just going to go through some of the variety of formats that we have, and also the many stories that are told in the materials within our collections. We have our rare books, including the 2 you see here. We have our gay and lesbian pulp fiction collection. The one on the left is The Price of Salt, which is written by Patricia Highsmith, who wrote under the pseudonym of Claire Morgan. And if you remember the film Carol from 2015, I believe, that movie is based on that book. Our other rare books, as an example, on the right is our books from Edward Carpenter, who is an English poet and an English philosopher who was one of the first to write, one of the earliest to write about sexual liberation and to talk about homosexuality. And so we have those early books from the late 1800s. Next slide. We also have our periodical collection, which is probably one of my favorite parts of the collection. On the far left there is our one of the earliest lesbian zines published in, or I should say, put together in the United States. It's a zine called Vice Versa, and the woman that you see in that picture there is Lisa Ben. Lisa Ben is an anagram for lesbian. Her real name is Edith Ide, and she basically put together this lesbian zine in 1947, first published at that period of time. And when I say published, I mean she was a secretary working in RKO Studios, and her boss used to tell her, while I'm gone, just look busy. If you don't have anything to do, just look busy. So she used that time to type out this lesbian zine, which she typed twice on 5 pieces of carbon paper. So for each issue, there was 12 copies total. And she would take these zines to lesbian bars, and it was really kind of her way to try to make a connection with other women. She's sort of just discovering her sexuality at that period of time. She was 24 years old and not really, kind of relatively new to Los Angeles, and that was her way of trying to meet other lesbian women. And so she carried that on for about a year, and we have the full run of Vice Versa. So that's, and she's also kind of a remarkable woman in various ways. I like talking about her a lot. In the middle there is Transvestia, which is one of the earliest gender nonconforming publications in the country. It was started in 1960 by this woman named Virginia Prince, who at the time identified as a heterosexual crossdresser. But this early publication, Transvestia, is kind of like one of the earliest outlets for gender nonconforming and trans women to meet each other and to find connections with other people. We also have BLK Magazine as an example of one of our African-American gay and lesbian magazines, which was, and BLK was published again out of Los Angeles, and it had a very long run during the 1980s. So, next slide, please. Yes, so into our archival collections, we also have organizational records from different gay and lesbian organizations. The image on your right is a flyer from our collection called Pride, and Pride at the time stood for Personal Rights in Defense and Education, and it was a kind of radical gay rights group that was formed in the late 1960s. And this particular flyer was in response to a bar raid that happened at the Black Cat Bar in Silver Lake area of Los Angeles. And what happened was on 1967 New Year's Day, 2 years before Stonewall, the clock struck midnight, people celebrated, gay men kissed, and at that point, vice cops and police, Los Angeles Police Department, there was a raid that happened, which led to a riot, which led to several dozen men getting beat up. And this organization, Pride, started some protests and demonstrations in response to the police brutality that happened at that period of time. So this flyer is for one of its demonstrations that happened later that year. On the left there is our collection from ACT UP Los Angeles, which was a very in-your-face organization that meant to bring attention to the AIDS and HIV crisis that started in the 1980s. ACT UP was very vocal, very much about visibility and having direct action and doing a lot of protests. And we have the collection of their photographs and also documentation of all the different post demonstrations and movements that they did, including things like, getting more support and more rooms at the local hospitals, getting more AIDS and HIV services for prisoners, getting more funding for HIV and AIDS drugs and cures. So we have the ACT UP Los Angeles records, which is one of our very highly used collections. Next slide, please. We also have a variety of personal papers from people who are famous and not so famous. We want to collect a wide range of experiences to reflect the range of people. We're not a monolith, and the idea is that we want to collect the different experiences of all kinds of people who lived as gay and lesbian, who found their communities, who found their chosen families. And the picture on the left is one example of that. That picture is from our Esther Herbert and Marvel Doyle collection. And Esther and Marvel were lesbian women who were in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. And we have their letters. They were both stationed at two different locations. And so they would write to each other pretty much every day throughout the duration of the war. And so we have the letters documenting that exchange between this couple who were together at different times, but who were also with other women at different times. And so it's sort of like, it's sort of this amazing snapshot of life and people finding their way to other gay and lesbian people. And it's a wonderful collection, and there some photographs are included in that as well. The picture on the right, excuse me, is our collection from a guy named Lynn Edward Harris. And Lynn Edward Harris is an intersex person who was assigned female at birth. And over the course of his adolescence, he always knew about his intersex condition, and but kind of, it just carried on being who he was at the time. But by his late 20s, he made the choice to start living full-time as male, and he tried to change his gender marker on his driver's license, and the state of California did not allow him to do that at that time, even though he had a condition that said he was intersex. So that led to a legal battle where he was trying to change the gender marker on his identification, and that legal battle went on for 4 years. So for 4 years, there was no gender associated with him legally, and that leads to all sorts of different problems, whether it's getting your driver's license, getting a passport, all sorts of things. So he became a spokesperson and an activist talking about some of those issues related to that. So we have his collection as well. Next slide, please. We also have a variety of photograph collections in the in our archives as well. The photograph on the left is from our, in 2013, we received an envelope kind of unexpectedly with a series of about a dozen photographs. And these photographs show a wedding ceremony that happened between these gay men that happened in Philadelphia in 1957. And it's a private ceremony that happened in somebody's apartment. But as you can see there, it was only about a dozen photos showing this remarkable moment in time where these two men were getting married. There was somebody officiating the marriage. There was dancing. There's, as you see here, they're sharing a cake. They're kissing. And it's this very intimate, private the documentation of these two men who we don't know who they are, but we received these photographs from this woman who said, my parents owned a photo processing company, like a mom and pop shop for photo processing, and these were found among their materials. And she said, I don't know what to do with these photographs, but it seemed wrong to throw them out, so I'm sending them to you. And we're so grateful that she did, because they're just a wonderful but small, but really impacting collection. So we also have the photographs from a guy named Kent Garvey, who was a photographer for some local gay and lesbian news magazines. And he has these great photographs of all sorts of things, whether it's gay Olympic Games, pride parades, marches on Washington, you name it. But one of my favorite things about this collection is that he did go to some gay and lesbian events that normally wouldn't be documented by other news outlets, and photographed at those kinds of places. So the picture on your right, for example, is the activist Bayard Rustin, who was he was an advisor to Martin Luther King, and he was one of the main organizers around the civil rights marches in the 1960s. And he was an out gay man, and he was giving a keynote speech at this convention for the Black and White Men Together, which was this interracial support and activist organization that was formed in the 1980s. And so we have these great photographs of Bayard speaking at this event. Next slide, please. We've also have a number of not only artwork, but posters and other types of visual materials, and it includes things like artwork, so drawings and collage and graphic materials for promotional materials and stuff like that. But posters in particular are very much used for research. This poster right here, for example, was discovered relatively recently, or rediscovered, I should say. And it says, touch one another. Gay brothers and sisters, the Gay Liberation Front reminds you that you have every right in your bars that your straight sisters and brothers have in theirs. You may hold hands, keep your arm around a friend, and give a friendly kiss. And so this was part of a campaign in 1970 where the Gay Liberation Front was going to different bars and saying basically that you couldn't discriminate against gay and lesbian couples for showing the same kind of affection that a straight couple would. So so they were going to different bars and saying, just letting gay and lesbian folks in there know that not to hide your affection, not to hide who you are in these spaces. And so so they put up these posters at the bars that allowed them to do that. And otherwise they would protest in front of the bars until they said yes. So So any bar that was that agreed, it says this bar is liberated. That was their mantra. Next slide, please. We also have a variety of other objects and ephemera of all kinds. We have a large collection of matchbooks from gay bars, from gay lesbian bars. This is, a sample of some of the buttons that we have in our collection. But in addition to that, we also have a variety of things like LGBTQ t-shirts, costumes and promotional material of various kinds. We also have things like uniform and textiles and different things like that. So our ephemera and our objects and realia collections sort of run the gamut from dolls and toys to large costumes to some sculpture and other signage and things like that. So, so next slide, please. Yeah, so this is this is a photo, excuse me, an image of our digital librarian. This is actually kind of an old image. We recently migrated to a new digital asset management system, so it looks a little bit different, but this shows you the variety of photographs and paper records and graphic materials that we've had digitized and are available to browse online. So there's that. But at this point, I just wanted to go into a little bit about our staff and the folks that we have working behind the scenes. We currently have 6 full-time staff, including our director, who is the head of the department and also a faculty in the gender and sexuality studies. And so he has a foot in the library side as well as the college and university side of things. We also have a curator who is responsible for managing our exhibitions and public programs and events throughout the year. Our library supervisor manages our day-to-day maintenance of our building schedules and deliveries. Our reference librarian is the primary contact for our reference services and is also the person who does instruction for archival and primary source research for classes. We have another archivist who is hired to work on specific collections. And then there's me. So my responsibilities fall into 2 main categories. The first is the management of the archival collections and art collections. And so what that entails is processing or supervising others in processing the archival collections, organizing their storage, creating finding aids through archive space, putting catalog records online, things like that. The second part of my job is putting together proposals and managing grant-funded projects to digitize some of our collections, particularly some collections that may need, additional and very specific support. So, for example, a couple of years ago, I received a grant to catalog over 4,000 of our posters, which are now available on the USC Digital Library website. And so that required, the special hiring of somebody who can do, oversized items and things that were particularly fragile and not within the regular purview of what our digital library usually digitizes. We also are finishing a grant, which your colleague Barbara worked on in her internship to digitize thousands of letters to the editor written to One magazine throughout the 1950s and 60s. And these letters show a remarkable glimpse into the experiences of gay and lesbian people at a time when homosexuality was not talked about openly at all. We are also currently working on a grant to process and digitize some of our California-related history which was funded by the California State Library. And the rest of my job includes shared responsibilities among me and my colleagues, including reference services for our patrons, research assistance for our exhibitions and our programming, and other kinds of general administration for the USC Libraries. So working on committees that develop and administer policies around collection development and hiring, et cetera, et cetera. My own personal journey to this career is that I received my master's degree at the Moving Image Archiving and Preservation from NYU. And at that time, I was particularly interested in preserving film and video, but after doing a little bit of consulting work for a brief period of time, I got this job at One Archives, which included mostly papers and photographs, but also a variety of other things. And I fell in love with the collection. And so it also allowed me to work in a variety of formats, which I really enjoyed. And so I've actually been at One ever since. I've been there for 12 years now. And so what that means is I was there when it was a nonprofit organization, and it's transitioned now into a university archive environment. And so it's been really exciting to see that transition, but also to see the archive grow and change over the years. So that's kind of a summary of our work at One. And thank you so much for having me tonight, and I'd be happy to talk more and answer any questions. So thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Loni. That was really informative and very interesting. So now we could start a Q&A. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to post them into the chat here. And it looks like we have a couple. So we could start with this one. And I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly. So this is from Benjamin Lomelli. And the question is, what opportunities exist for current MLIS students who want to get involved with One Archives?
Yeah, so we have had a limited number of internships available every semester at One, and some of those include things like working on some of our grant-funded projects, and it could be a variety of materials or a variety of tasks and assignments depending on whether it's a virtual internship or an in-person internship. So obviously, because of COVID, we've been mostly doing virtual internships for the last couple of years. So types of projects that we've done included mostly working on metadata for some of our digitized collections. We are also starting to welcome back volunteers who are in the Los Angeles area who want to come and volunteer at our archive to help us process some of the physical collections. And so yeah, you can email me about that if you have any questions, or email our main website page. So
great. And we'll include the link to that website in a document in the chat for everybody. So there's another question from Anya Rose Ramo, and that is, how do you get a job like this after graduating the MLIS program? What steps do you take to get there?
So that's a good question. Let's see. I think I sort of happened upon this job at One. I was looking for a job after I got my master's degree, and it started as a contract archivist position. So I was hired just for a 2-year term at the time to do archival processing and stuff like that. But I would say if I had any kind of advice for current or recently graduated library students is to if you're a student, to try to get as many internships as you can. I think it's a great way to get a variety of experiences, but also to know what you like and what you don't like. And, you might be surprised, you might actually like doing metadata when you thought, oh God, that sounds really boring. So, it could be any variety of things. Yeah, and I think, I, as a student, I did several internships, and I tried to volunteer in some places when I could, when I had the time to do so. So, and that helped me get into a few different types of environments. And I worked at a museum. I did an internship at a public library, but also at a university preservation departments. And so I had experiences in different types of aspects of the library job. So
Great. Sure that all came together, all those different skills. And speaking of metadata, here's a question from Satomi Honio. And the question is, what metadata schema do you use to process your collections?
yeah, so let's see. For our archival collections, we create finding aids using EAD, which we administer through Archivespace. And so for anybody who's done archival research at a lot of universities use this particular database. In our digitized materials and our metadata for our digitized materials, we use a Dublin Core. We call it a qualified Dublin Core. So it's based on Dublin Core for our metadata for the materials that we have in our digital library.
All righty, and so let me look into this chat. And Sarah Walters asks, what DAM software does the archives use? What websites and software programs do you use the most often for the archives?
Yeah, sure. So our archival collections, the physical collections, and our finding aids are done through Archivespace. Until very recently, we were using Content DM for our digital asset management system. But we recently migrated to this new system called Orange Logic, which is actually a proprietary database that is not traditionally used for university archives, but our digital library decided to go that route because they wanted a certain amount of customization that typical library DAM systems didn't have. So Orange Logic is what we use for our DAM system. For our library, we use Alma and Primo, which is for our catalog records for our periodicals and books.
Great. And sorry, Kim, I moved the chat. So let me scroll up. I think I skipped a question here. So Kim has a question. Is homophily, I think I'm pronouncing that wrong.
File, yeah.
Homophile, a broadly accepted term for the period from 1950s to before Stonewall, or is that a term primarily used only at your institution? And I could read that again if you need me
No,
to.
I think I got.
Okay.
It's not really for our institution, but in terms, I guess it's a term that really, LGBT historians know pretty well, or kind of somewhat widely used among LGBT historians. So, but yeah, it sort of refers to that period where it wasn't really gay liberation or gay rights movement that you might associate with Stonewall, being in the streets and marching, but it was more about organizing and finding, just building identity. I think is kind of how building, a sense of identity, and the idea of homosexuality being a minority is kind of what, some of the early conversations around that, from that period of time. So so if you think about, the World War II as being, part of a great migration of people who are for the first time, outside of their, outside of their typical homes, and either they're going into service, or they're going into workplaces where it's mostly women or it's mostly men, and people really just being out on their own for the first time, and going out to, the coastal cities and things like that. World War II had a major impact on building, had a major impact of LGBT people finding each other. And so there was sort of this sense of, finding community during that period of time. And so Homophile was the celebration of finding that community, and discovering that part of your sexuality. So.
All right, so it looks like we have a couple more minutes here. And so the next question's from Barbara, who mentioned she had a really great internship at one. And her question is there a specific era, format, or subject matter within the LGBTQ history that the archives is looking to add or expand on?
Yeah, I think, it's, I think like most archives, we, and most libraries, we are trying to respond to the idea of visibility for people of color, and for having more representation in our collections of people who are, people of color, women, gender nonconforming people. And that is something that we are always looking to develop more within our collections. And I think that's kind of standard across a lot of different a lot of different archives and collections. It's something that whether actively or passively, we don't have as much material documenting, especially, people of color, working class, a variety of different communities who are underrepresented in our collections. And so that's definitely something we want to show. We want to try to have more representation as much as possible. And so we're trying to look toward collaborating with different communities, and trying to outreach to different folks to see how we could increase that representation in our collections.
All righty, so a little bit of time for a couple more questions. So this is from Maya. Do you advertise for donation to the collection? If so, how do you do so?
I wouldn't say that we advertise. I think it is something that whenever we have public programs, or whenever we have when we interact with the public, we do say that we're always looking to add more materials to our collections. But I think our outreach efforts we've been trying to be more targeted to, as I said, communities that aren't represented as much in our collection. And so we're trying to be more proactive in building relationships in that sense, rather than sort of passively accepting collections, of things that get donated to us. And so, so I think we're trying to target our efforts at outreach for collection development.
Great. And so Loni, you mentioned sharing either your email or the email to the One Archives for opportunities.
Mhm.
Which email would you like us to share in the chat?
You're welcome to use my email. That's fine. And actually, I think my last slide had that information, but your
Oh,
my
okay.
email is fine too. So
We'll put that in the
Great.
chat for everybody. Thank you.
yeah.
Great. So it looks like Barbara's going to add that to the chat. There was a question about that. And then, so it looks like we have to wrap up, and we'll try to get to the last couple questions. We could, Barbara, do we post that on the blog or?
Oh, no, so we can copy them and then try to get answers to them at a later time, but we just want to be mindful of everybody's time. So we are going to need to wrap up. Thank you so much, Loni, for your time and all your knowledge and all the work that you do with One. I had a wonderful experience and enjoyed going through all those records and learning about the history. So again, thank you so much for being with us this evening, and for everybody who, logged in to listen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jenny, do you want to? Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Loni. That was very informative. And thank you for answering all those questions. So at this point, we're going to wrap up this presentation from One Archives at USC Libraries. And before we leave, there's another presentation from SAASC in November. And so that's going to be November 3rd at 6:30. And that guest presenter is from the Getty Research Institute Archives Center. So thank you,
You can
everybody,
check
for
out our
joining.
website. Oh, sorry. Yes, thank
And
you,
you can
everybody.
check out our website.
Exactly. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night and check out our website for more information. Thank you once again, Loni, for your time.
Thank you so much and have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.